We are incredibly honored and pleased to have three incredibly special individuals who are working every day to make sure that unemployment insurance is administered well and to make sure that those who are unemployed are taken care of. We have from the state of New Mexico, the Secretary of Workforce Solutions, Bill McCamley. We have from the state of Georgia, the Senate Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Blake Tillery. And we've got from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Alison Dembeck, who is the Vice President of Education and Labor Advocacy. With that, the run of show today is very basic. We're going to have initial presentations from all of our speakers, and then we're going to get into a Q&A approximately 12:30, 12:35. However, if you have questions that are timely to what's being presented, please put them in the chat box and we'll make sure to get to them. Without further ado, I am going to turn it over to our first speaker, Mr. Bill McCamley from the state of New Mexico.
Stephen, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. We really appreciate y'all taking an interest in this. It is something that is very near and dear to our hearts. And the point of this presentation is to put some real numbers and some real faces on the situation that we find ourselves in today. So Courtney, if we go to the next slide. As you all know, unemployment was never designed as a system to provide long-term full funding for people being out of work for a long length of time. It was designed as a stopgap. Hey, look, I lost my job. I need 3 or 4 months just of basic needs to get by before I can get my old one back. Well, we are not in that situation right now. And as you all know, the volume of people on the system has been unlike anything anybody has ever seen, including from 10 years ago in the Great Recession. I was not around then, but all of my compatriots in different states say this is much, much more serious than it was back then. Just to show you some numbers from New Mexico, 9,600 people were basically certifying for unemployment the week of March 9th. We are not about, actually it's about 119, 120,000 since I wrote this. That increased from about 104,000 from November 16th. We had a stay-at-home pause for a couple of weeks as our COVID cases were rising to literally levels that we could not sustain. We're still having issues with our hospitals, but that 2-week pause has let us solidify our unemployment number, or excuse me, our COVID numbers, but unfortunately it has led to an increase back up of unemployment levels. That $300 a week that we give people, it's just not something people can actually live off for months at a time. And that's really why it's important we extend the benefits. So can I go to the next slide, please, Courtney? So here are the requests from the National Government Association. We agree with all of these. Please work on trying some kind of extensions for the PUA, PEUC, and FPUC from the CARES Act. Our big request there is please keep it simple. The more complicated the program is, the longer it takes for us to get it into place, the more testing we have to do, and the higher the risk involved in screwing up all the other programs on our system that people are getting benefits off of now. Can we get the funding necessary for offices like ours to be able to continue to serve these massive amounts of people that are on our system? Funding is really important for our offices. Making sure that the grants for reimbursable employers, the 501c3s, the government agencies, the Indian tribes, which I'm going to talk about, remain at that 100% level for another time period into the future. And we need to talk about trust funds. Our trust fund at New Mexico was $465 million. In March. It was gone at the beginning of September, and the consequences for not finding ways of reimbursing states for that are going to be huge, and I'll talk about that. Next slide, please, Courtney. Thank you. So what are we talking about with the extension of the CARES Act programs? When the FPUC expired in late July, our call center started receiving a huge increase in asks for additional help. Hey, look, I'm going from making $900 a week to $300 a week. That's not going to work for me in feeding my kids. That's not going to work for me in meeting my house payments. And we had to start actually training our staffers on assisting a little bit those folks in finding those other resources. And we had to start getting mental health training for our staff because the stories they were hearing were so crazy. And I'll talk about that in a second too. There was a large increase in New Mexico with the need for SNAP, housing assistance, and food banks, stories you've seen across the country. And if you look at the numbers, what we're seeing is that New Mexicans are cycling off of the standard unemployment claims into these federally funded programs. So as of last Friday, when I put this together, we had 118,000 people on the system. 60% of them were on federally funded programs. So if PUA goes away at the end of the year, we've already got people cycling off because they're hitting their 39 weeks of benefits, which is when the program goes away, or the end of the calendar year. Those 32,000 people on PUA are going to go from getting something to getting nothing. The PEUC people can shift because we do have federal extension benefits, but those folks are going to run out in March at the latest as well. You're going to have a whole heck of a lot of people in this state that go from getting something to zero. And the stories and the problems that are going to be heard from that are going to be crazy. Next slide, please, Courtney. Thank you. We in New Mexico, and I want to talk a little bit about IT systems, have been doing pretty well. My predecessor, this is not on me, I want to give her credit, chose to modernize the unemployment computer system here in New Mexico before I got here. And we've been fairly successful as state goes. We've been able to distribute a lot of money. As you can see, we get 68% of our claims turned around with payment in 3 weeks or less. And we were the 7th state in the country to implement all 3 of those CARES Act programs all within April. That's pretty good turnaround times, but we were able to do so because our IT system is modernized. Look, I was born in 1978. A lot of the states around the country are using computer systems that are older than I am, with a computer programming language that was written when my dad was in high school, COBOL. And that is really a huge barrier to a lot of states being able to get these things done and done quickly and get money into people's pockets. I will also say that the staffing needs have been crazy. We are on our fifth round of hiring 20 call center staff internally within New Mexico's department. And we've also been working with Deloitte. We have an additional 25 call center staff and some other people helping us with some adjudication things. So the funding to be able to keep that staffing going and the flexibility for states to continue to use these contract services is a really big deal. We're one of the states that actually uses the least amount of contract services, and we still need them moving forward because the numbers remain so high. Next slide, please, Courtney. For the reimbursable employers, other folks can talk about cities, counties, and nonprofits, but to put a real personal thing on the situation, I'd like to talk about our Indian tribes. We have 23 of them here in New Mexico. They have been very, very hard hit by COVID. You have a combination, especially in the Navajo Nation, a combination of lots of people living in multi-generational houses, yet people without running water. And there are a lot of families that still they're not able to sanitize regularly because they don't have running water. And they were one of the first places in the country to become a huge hotspot. They got it under control, but unfortunately now they're back under a 3-week lockdown. There are pleas on Twitter to try to get more hospital staff in there, and they're going up again. And to require these folks to then contribute back to unemployment is going to be really, really hard. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit about trust funds. Like I said, we were at a pretty healthy amount in March. We were completely exhausted because of the massive amount of increase we had throughout the spring and summer. As of last Friday, we were $180 million in the hole to the United States Department of Labor and Title 12 loans to make sure we could continue to provide unemployment benefits for our New Mexicans that absolutely have to have those things. As of now, the 0% interest on those loans runs out at the end of the calendar year. We are going to try to find, and we should be able to find, an interest payment for the amount we're going to have by the end of the year in September when it's due, but it's going to be tough. And then moving forward from there, we don't have a plan for that to this time. Look, we need either some kind of grants or some kind of loan forgiveness to be able to help with our trust fund situation. And at the very least, we need an extension of those interest-free payments. And if that doesn't happen at the federal level, let me just tell you that I sat on a tax committee in the state legislature here in New Mexico for 6 years. And I'll tell you, money doesn't come at the end of rainbows, and it doesn't come out of the rear ends of unicorns. It's got to come out from somewhere, right? And our budgets are already stretched. And if we were to try to find some from our reserves, that's going to be a tough ask. Or the only other thing is to raise taxes on businesses. And that'll either happen at the state level, or if states refuse to do so, the federal government will raise their portion of the federal unemployment taxes starting in the fall of 2022, 0.2% per year until whatever loan remains paid off. So like I said, it's not magic. It's got to come from somewhere. We would prefer it coming from y'all right now to help us, because if taxes go up on businesses, these are the folks who we're going to be relying upon to hire these folks back that are on unemployment now, and increasing their burden ain't going to help anybody. Next slide, please. I just want to spend 3 slides personalizing the situation for you. I pulled 4 emails that I got in the last week. New Mexico is a small state. Everyone's got my email since the beginning of March, middle of March when we went to this. I have gotten probably 10,000 of these. If it was less than that, I'd be real surprised. I get these every day, all the time. These are not actually the most serious emails I get, but I want you to take a second and read these. These are real people with real stories in real pain that need real help, and they need it now. Look, y'all, I've always thought I was a tough guy. I played hockey and soccer for 20 years. I boxed in college. I've had teeth broken, ribs broken, fingers broken, been knocked out more times than I can count. I cry regularly in this job. This is the hardest thing that I have ever done because of the amount of people and the amount of pain. You all extending help to these folks will help them get through this situation, and it matters. Next slide, please, Courtney. As you all know, and you've seen across the country, the lack of help for unemployment has led to people going anywhere they can. This is a picture from New Mexico in the University of New Mexico football stadium from the Roadrunner Food Bank delivering meals for Thanksgiving. They, in the past, have done about 500 families. This year, they did about 3 times that. In fact, just this morning, I see people standing out in the 28-degree weather waiting in line for food banks. These problems are real. If people can't get funding to help them in the grocery stores, they got to rely on charity, and that only lasts so long. And last slide, please, Courtney. Just to let y'all know, this does not just affect the people on unemployment, it affects our staff. This was a car in our parking lot in my hometown of Las Cruces, New Mexico, the Monday after Thanksgiving. It was blown up. We had to report that this situation existed to our state police. They worked with the local fire department, and they found traces of glass and a rag. So someone blew up a car of ours with a Molotov cocktail. And what is the situation here? I mean, we've been threatened. We've had minor vandalism, people taking out our windows with baseball bats and such. This is an escalation. And what it means is this: people are hurt. People are scared out of their rear ends, and that hurt and anger is turning into action. And the problem is when people get cut off from benefits, it comes from us or it doesn't come from us. And I'm really worried about the safety of our staff moving forward because of the pain people are feeling in their communities. And we're taking some actions to help try to deal with it. We've got to provide mental health counseling to our staff, but just know that the consequences are also with the staffers at the state level. Courtney, I'm done. I appreciate your time in listening to me here. We appreciate the ask, and I'll be here to answer any questions when we get through the rest of the presentation. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Secretary McCamley, and thank you for all you're doing to protect your staff and to make sure that unemployed are taken care of. I'd like to next turn it over to Senator Blake Tillery, who's going to share the perspective from Georgia. Senator Tillery, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you, Secretary. I'm going to just make my remarks somewhat in contrast and comparison to what you've heard the Secretary talk about for New Mexico. He mentioned that at the beginning of the pandemic, as you look at March, as we rolled in, they had about 9,600 claims, and that jumped to 118,000. In Georgia, we saw ours jump up to 885,000. And I want to compare that to the fact that we've got a 4.4 million person labor pool. So you're seeing roughly 20% of our labor pool is applying for benefits. And other ways, just kind of break this down. I think the easiest way, that's an overarching trend, but let's walk through just kind of 3 segments, talk about pre-COVID, the worst, and then where we are right this minute. Pre-COVID, Georgia had about $2.5 billion in our unemployment trust fund. We were sitting pretty healthy, healthier than most states by far. We saw roughly 3,000 to 6,000 initial claims each month and had about a 3% unemployment rate. At the worst, as you roll into April and May, you saw that jump up to about 380,000 initial claims every week. We were carrying continuing claims of about 885,000, the number I mentioned to you previously, that was roughly 20% of our labor force. And we had a 1-week unemployment rate of 20.18%. You average for that month to be about 13% unemployment rate that month. Now where we sit, I told you that we started with a $2.5 billion trust fund. We're now at a point where we have borrowed, as of, I believe today, $855 million from the feds. We've got still 29,000 roughly initial claims each week, and we have a continuing claim basis of 253,000 Georgians that are still on UE benefits. That puts our unemployment rate right now around 5.7%. While I say that, one of the things that we've done this a little bit differently is we use some of our CRF funds, and I know that many of you want to hear a little bit about that, to help backfill what we couldn't use them to backfill, so I'll pick my words a little more carefully there. to take and apply towards the $855 million that we've already borrowed. So one of the things that I think you'd hear us ask for is something you've heard constantly. If we had a little bit of flexibility with those funds, we'd actually be able to take some more of that money and put it into hold it in our trust fund for later. The reason I say that is we put 1.2 billion of the 4 billion-ish allocated to Georgia into our unemployment trust fund in order to pay back the benefits that we borrowed from the state. Since we've only used 855 million, and here we sit on December 9th, as you know, if we don't have those out the door by December 30th, they trickle back up. We could hold roughly 400 million for unemployment benefits if we had just a small little bit of flexibility there. So that would be the ask that I would make of where we're going. Otherwise, we stand prepared to help Georgians, and we know you do too.
Thank you, Senator Tillery. And thank you for the call for flexibility. I think we all agree. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Alison Dembeck from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks everyone for taking time out of what I know are your busy schedules to talk about this important issue. This is something that is important to the individuals who are going to be eligible for unemployment insurance. It's obviously something that is important to the states and local governments who are trying to help these individuals, and it's important to the employers who are trying to keep everybody employed and safe in the same process. You know, I will also keep my remarks fairly short so that we can answer questions, because I think that that's probably the most helpful. But you know, this is one of those things, right, where the federal government's intervention was really, really important at the beginning of March, creating the two federally funded programs, you know, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance and the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation. And you know, with the expiration of those programs, at the end of this year, as the Secretary mentioned, in New Mexico, those numbers are staggering. But if you actually look at the number of unemployed, what we expect to be countrywide, it's going to be 16 million Americans who are expected to be without benefits in the new year, and that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people who are going to be struggling to figure out where their rent check, where their food, where all of that is going to come from. And that doesn't take into account anybody who would be newly laid off. And you know, employers are really struggling to keep their places of business open. They're struggling to keep their employees employed. And there's also the realization that as winter continues, those numbers of unemployed are just going to grow. The Chamber has estimated that there's 10 million fewer jobs now than there were before March. And that, again, that's a number that is also going to continue to grow. Now, part of that is looking at other programs and trying to help employers through other programs. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the importance of improving and extending the payroll protection program. I mean, some of that can be extended quickly and now, and improvements and all can be made later in the next Congress. A lot of the PPP program was meant to be very, very temporary, and clearly this situation is going on longer than we all thought. So some of those changes might need to be a little more midterm. But in the same way that the PPP program is meant to be critical help for employers to keep people employed and to keep businesses open and to keep customers safe, the unemployment programs, these pandemic unemployment programs, are critical to the employees and to the individuals. And I would be remiss also if I didn't mention that while the Chamber thinks that the $600 supplemental income on the pandemic insurance, that was a little high. We do support the idea of having a targeted wage replacement somewhere in the 80 to 90% of an individual's working wages, with that amount capped at about $400. So I mean, that's really important. If you don't have supplemental income that is equal to what it is that you've been earning, how can you afford to pay your bills? We all budget, and not having the money that we've relied on to meet those needs is very difficult. So overall, employers have been trying to take creative ways to keep their doors open. They've been trying to take advantage, for example, of some of the short-term compensation programs that have been able to develop under the CARES Act. For example, employers can, in states where it's possible, employers have reduced some employees' hours, and employees have been able to pick up that lost income through UI. So wages have been split between the UI system and the employer system. But all of that has to continue through an extension through federal action. And the last point I want to really mention is that this idea of the states having their trust funds hit low numbers. I mean, and it depends on what those numbers are for each state. Some states have automatic taxing triggers. That becomes a real big concern for employers. Employers are already struggling to figure out how to pay to stay open safely, implement new measures to do that. There's already high costs for things like PPE, not to mention trying to keep staff on. They want to keep as many especially our small and mid-sized employers. They want to keep their staff. They're like family. But the idea of having a tax increase at this time, there just is not money in the budget for the employers to do that. And as that tax increase hits, if that tax increase hits, there are other more difficult decisions that are going to have to be made, and we worry that then results in seeing additional people ending up on unemployment and ending in this really cyclical struggle that I think we'd all like to avoid. So at the end of the day, we're talking about individuals, we're talking about businesses, we're talking about states and local governments. That the time and the need for relief is real. Before businesses end up shutting their doors and millions of families end up falling below the poverty line. We need to do something now. So thanks. I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Alison, and thanks for your leadership and for the chamber being a validator for action needing to happen. Just really quickly, just to recap what all of our speakers have asked for. First, the crux of this issue for NGA and for all of the speakers that we've heard from thus far, unemployment programs need to continue. The extension of the expiring programs that expire on December 31st are critical. And we talk about the human cost. All of you know these numbers, but 12 million individuals are taking advantage of the unemployment programs that are expiring in the next few days. We are pleading with Congress for action on those. The other piece that I want to flag is, and everyone has brought this up, is the trust fund issue. We've heard from Georgia, New Mexico, and the chamber on the impacts there. But when you think about the trust fund issue, it is a national issue. It is not a state-by-state issue. 21 states have taken out approximately $43 billion in loans from the federal government to replenish their depleted trust funds. And an additional 14 states have invested $5.5 billion additional money into their trust funds from their coronavirus relief fund. And we expect more action in the coming days in order to bolster those funds. 34 states have run into issues with their trust funds. Red states, blue states, it's bipartisan, the hurt that has happened because of the trust funds being depleted. And then finally, nonprofits and state agencies that are working hard to make sure that people are taken care of, they need resources from the federal government as well. We have some prepared questions, but I would encourage those who have questions to start to use the chat box to start to engage in a conversation with our guest speakers. We do have an initial question from David Thompson from the Council of Nonprofits, and it's specifically about the nonprofit issue. He's asking the panelists to speak to the policy request for increasing the federal coverage of costs reimbursable to employers, nonprofits, local governments, and federally recognized tribes. Bill, you mentioned this in your remarks. I'll actually turn to you first and see if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, the travel situation is something that we have out here out west that a lot of folks don't really have. And basically, look, the message is they're getting hit real hard. Don't hit them any harder. I would also say that the other example that comes to mind on the nonprofit side is we got a lot of childcare centers out here that are, up and down, depending on the situations. And they might have to put some of their folks back on unemployment. If they're going to have to start paying back into that as a reimbursable employer, it's going to really hurt our ability as New Mexicans to keep those operations going so that when people do go back to work, obviously childcare is one of the biggest barriers for people, especially single moms, to get back into the workforce. And you'll see that group of folks is one of the ones that's hardest hit by this pandemic as a whole. So extending that is a really important issue. And there's a whole lot of other examples you can add to that, but those are the two that come to mind right off the top of my head.
Other speakers want to weigh in here?
I mean, this isn't as much of our bailiwick. A little bit on the side of the fact that state and local chambers are nonprofits, and in many cases, they've also had to do significant layoffs, which has been a problem in terms of trying to make sure that they have staff available to help the local businesses, their small and mid-sized businesses who are coming to them with help about how to navigate all this. And in the meantime, they've had to lay off staff and they're having difficulty doing that. So I don't know that we've necessarily delved, or I have not delved very deep into this side of it. I will say one of the other areas though that we have been focusing on is ensuring that nonprofits get the help that they need through the PPP program, because that is, if you can't continue to operate your nonprofit, then back to my point earlier, you're going to continue to have to lay off your staff, and that's what we want to try to avoid. We want to keep as many people employed during all of this as possible.
Thank you, Allison. So moving on to the next question. Really specifically for those state representatives we have from New Mexico and Georgia, the unemployment situation is a crisis in and of itself. Another crisis is state and local budgets and the shortfalls that are happening in other states, but also the intertwined relationship between unemployment and state budgets, and in some cases unemployment helping state budgets. For Senator Tillery and for Secretary McCamley, what is the economic picture in your state, and how do federal unemployment programs interplay with that? Senator Tillery.
Yeah, carrying you back first, I think to understand Georgia's story, though, you have to actually start before. I was looking at our economic outlook of how December 2019 looked, and we actually were trending negative. In personal income tax, we were, for the first time in many years in Georgia, and then sales tax as well. So in 19, before we even knew there was going to be a pandemic, Georgia's revenues were a little bit soft. Although globally and nationally, you'd say that things were gangbusters, things were going well. As we rolled into the pandemic, we took $2.2 billion out of Georgia's budget, so a little right around 10% out, preparing for what was going in now. And I can tell you it's the weirdest conundrum you've ever seen, because our revenues are actually extremely strong. There's a few things I'd factor to that. Again, I carry you back again, 2019, things are good. Our revenues are soft. Right now, where we sit in December 2020, some things look good, others really don't. And our revenues we're $500 million over budget right now. And that's over revenues from last year. So it's extremely interesting. I just saw the governor's release earlier this morning that we're up 8% again in December of 2020 over December of 2019. Part of why we think that is initially was because of unemployment benefits. Obviously, Georgia benefits pay out at $365 a week. Obviously, the Fed add on to that was $600, so you're at $965. In Georgia, we changed a little rule that said you could make up to $300 a week without having a dollar for dollar set off on state unemployment. So I guess theoretically you could have earned up to $1,265. I'm not sure that many of our citizens took advantage of all those options at once. But theoretically, I guess they could have, when many were used to making around $400 to $500 a week. So we saw our personal income tax in Georgia just take off. Personal income tax in Georgia is 5.75%. So it's not a huge amount of any one paycheck, but collectively it was huge. I'm diving into this deeper, Stephen. I can keep going if you want me to, or give time for the others to explain how we saw that affect us monthly.
Go for it. I think that perspective is important.
We if you go back and look 2017, 18, 19, 20, you'll see roughly $1 million transfers from the Department of Labor, where we do our unemployment benefits, to the Department of Revenue each month. So as we withhold state unemployment taxes on unemployment benefits, it's roughly $1 million a month. Sometimes it's 700,000, might be as high as 1.3, but roughly $1 million. We saw that number jump substantially during the pandemic, up to at times over $100 million a month that was being transferred from labor to Treasury on just the withholdings of unemployment benefits. Now in Georgia, we had to deep dive into that even more because it added up to be over $500 million. So if that money's coming in right now, I know that there's a huge chance that money can go out on a return or a refund in the early first or second quarter of 2021. We know that of the people drawing unemployment benefits in Georgia, roughly 90% made less than $30,000 a year, 70% made less than $10,000 a year. So while we're sitting, high on the hog, so to speak, right now, we've got revenues in the bank, we're outpacing what our numbers look like even in 2019. If we're not sitting $500 million to the plus as we roll into January or February, I'm extremely concerned that we're going to see that exit really quickly on refunds in April, May, maybe even March.
Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, Stephen. So New Mexico's in a little bit of a weird situation, like Louisiana, Alaska, some other states. We rely very, very heavily, probably somewhat too heavily, on oil and gas revenue for both direct infusions into our state budgets, as well as providing jobs for people to do personal income tax, sales tax, et cetera. About a third of our revenue every year comes from that. Now, we were worried that was going to go down to $30 a barrel. It stayed up around 40. It's now at 45. So we're in a much better position than we thought we were going to be. But Stephen, if I could kind of put on another hat, back 15 years ago when I had pretty hair like Senator Tillery's, I was a county commissioner. And the government agencies that are really getting hurt in New Mexico are the state or the local levels, your cities and your counties, the folks that rely on that local sales tax to really make something work. In addition to what Senator Tillery said about the unemployment benefits really providing a bump for personal income taxes for the state level, I will tell you, for people listening on this cast, that money, when it hits people's bank accounts, does not stay there. It goes immediately, and I mean immediately, back into the economies to help the businesses that Ms. Dembeck is here representing, to make sure that the sales taxes that the cities and counties rely on are funded. We had a situation in September, mid-September, where we had a Sunday IT issue, and payments got delayed literally for 24 hours. We got so many calls, texts, social media messages, the whole run of the thing saying, look, I wait at 7:30 in the morning or whenever I get this thing. I hit my ATM, I'm paying my utility bills by 9 o'clock. I'm paying my mortgage, I'm paying my rent, I'm paying for childcare, I'm going to buy food. This money does not go off to the Cayman Islands. It goes right back into local economies. So this is not only a benefit for those folks directly, but the recycling of that money back in the communities helps local businesses and helps state and local governments really with their budgets as well. And those are the folks we're counting on to pick up your trash, fund local cops, fund your local water systems, all that stuff.
Stephen, if I can just kind of jump in to piggyback on everything that's already been said, I think it's part of why where the Chamber's position is that having the UI benefits be equal or close to 80-90% of what an individual's income is incredibly important, because people do budget and that money does go right back in. That said, we do get concerned when the amount of money is significantly higher, like in the situations that Senator Tillery described, because we want to make sure that employees are actually going back to work as well. And some states didn't have those problems because the extra $600 didn't necessarily mean that that those employees were making more money than they would have been otherwise. A lot of that has to do with cost of living. And so if you're, kind of talking to you guys as the staffers, if you're coming from a state where your costs of living are higher, you may not have had constituents who have had that problem. But in states where your cost of living is a lot lower, having that extra $600 really did, and it was something that we were hearing from our employer community almost immediately, that there are job openings and they weren't able to fill them because people were making more money off of unemployment. So we really need to fix it. We really need to extend that extra money. I mean, we're definitely in favor of doing that for the very reasons that have been outlined, but we just want to be careful that we strike the right balance in doing that and aren't creating a perverse incentive that keeps people out of the workforce for longer than necessary.
Thank you. Incredibly important perspectives. The other piece really is, since we've started this day, we do have some information on potential proposals that are circulating around UI. One that was circulated this morning would extend UI through mid-April. As we think about, obviously that is not the final, and Congress has a long way to go before we get a potential COVID relief deal with hopefully unemployment insurance in it. As we think about what the unemployment picture looks like in your state, if anybody's willing to weigh in, either from a business perspective or a state perspective, on kind of what the outlook looks like as far as the unemployed, whether you see conditions improving or whether you see potential spikes in unemployment given spikes in infections, we'd welcome your perspectives now.
I'll tackle it first. Carrying you back again to March and April, we saw over 500,000 jobs, 525,000 jobs disappear in Georgia. And we've incrementally been adding those back at pops of 50 to 75,000 to 100,000 a month. We're still sitting at about $125,000 dollars. We're talking in dollars, 125,000 job deficit right now. And a lot of those, we are concerned, may have changed. We're not certain that all of the businesses that Alison has mentioned are coming back. Whether they be, now some of it's because they've changed. As we talk to some of our restaurateurs, they're actually having higher margins now, even though they may be paying, then that's great for them. We're happy for the entrepreneurs, but they're employing less people in those higher margins. They don't need as many people to keep a dining room open when they can do more or just as much business now through the drive-through. So I don't know where that's going to sort out at the end. The other thing that the secretary tapped on just a little bit was childcare. We are at a point now where two-parent homes are trying to figure out how they educate their children to a point that one of them's going to have to decide that they're not able to work anymore. You can drag this out for 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, but we're not going to be able to take it for 18 months. And we're starting to hear that from just the stress levels of parents and families. So where this goes, I'm not exactly certain. I wish I had the crystal ball and could tell you. I could tell you that none of us sat here last year and thought we'd be sitting in this position now. So whatever the future holds, I'm sure some of it's going to be brighter than we thought it would be, and some of it's going to be even more creative. Americans are ingenious. They have extreme ingenuity. Who would have thought that we'd be doing this call like this even 6 months ago? Our ability to participate in so many more things and share information has improved so much as well. So what I'm seeing in Georgia is a much larger growth in technology. We're seeing a lot of logistics growth. I'm in a small South Georgia town, and we have speculative buildings. That's how we usually incentivize growth of business and industry, that we have sold 3 times over. You have someone who's bought it, you have someone who's bought the second on it, and you have somebody standing behind them who's willing to put down $15,000 to $25,000 just to have the third option on a 100,000 square foot space. So I do not think everything is doom and gloom, or there aren't good days ahead. There may be some rain clouds before we get there, but the crops aren't going to grow unless it rains a little bit. So I think the outlook from Georgia is a little bit cautious, but bright.
And from some of the research that the chamber has done, as I mentioned, that there's 10 million fewer jobs than before a shutdown, which in itself is a scary number. And to Senator Tiller's point, not all of those jobs are going to come back just by the nature of changes that we're going to have to make. But our projection is that the US isn't actually going to regain those lost jobs until February. I mean, we're looking at February 2022. So it's more than a year away where we're looking at some of that. And if you talk to some of the airlines, some of those companies that have been hardest hit in the tourism and hospitality space, that some of what they're projecting is even longer than that. I did also want to kind of piggyback on something else that the senator talked about in terms of the fact that the other concern is that there are communities that have been disproportionately impacted by this. You know, we've got 2.2 million women who have left the workforce because of needing to take care of children or homeschooling or any of those combinations of things. And so we really do need to look at making sure that there is childcare included in, strong childcare provisions included in whatever pandemic relief comes through, because people do need to make sure that their children are in a safe place so that they can head back to work. But it's not just issues around childcare. There were 14.2% of women with disabilities were unemployed in October. So, women with disabilities have been significantly impacted. When you're looking at women and men, African-American women and men who are between the ages of 20 and 24, African-American women who in that age range, they had unemployment rates of 15%, where the African-American men have unemployment rates of 20.6%. And if you look at the same age groups for Latino women, Latinas, right, they're at 9.4%. And so it's just, and I'll say, to be honest, right, like the white men are in the 9.6%. So there are definitely disparities in how people are being impacted and who is being impacted. And we need to make sure that we're taking that into account as well, because we want to make sure that as things recover and as we get there, because to the senator's point, we will get there. But as we get there, that we're making sure that everybody has opportunities. That's part of what is wonderful about this country, is making sure that everybody has opportunities, and we don't want to make that situation worse, create a wider disparity because of the pandemic.
Yes, Stephen. So you asked us about where we see going forward. During the Great Recession, at the height of the Great Recession in March of 2011, I think it was, we had about 60,000 people in New Mexico receiving unemployment benefits. That was the worst that it got. We're at double that right now. We were as high as 150,000, more than that in June. And it took us years to recover from the Great Recession. Those numbers came down slowly and incrementally, and the economists in our office are basically saying it's going to take us years to recover from this. Now, some of these jobs are going to come back fairly quickly, but even if half of them came back in the next 6 months, we'd still be at where we were at the worst part of the Great Recession, and then having to start getting those folks back to work. So this is going to go on for a little while, and Ms. Dembeck's comments are spot on. You're going to have a lot of people out there that need childcare. You're going to have a lot of folks with pre-existing health conditions. They're going to be pretty worried about this until they get a vaccine, and that's going to be, probably months away as well. I will also say to both the previous speakers' points, the economy is not going to look the same place in 6 months as it did 6 months, 9 months ago. I mean, I'll just give you an example from our internal stuff. We had been playing around with the idea at our department about moving all our call center employees home. Utah did that a couple of years ago, just as a good business practice. And we were starting to kind of poke around, hey, is this something we can do? Well, in April, we had to do it. The governor said, get everybody's ass home, get them away from the office, go. And we did in like a 2 or 3 week span. We did lift and shifts on our computers. We had to kind of come up with agreements and all that kind of stuff, but we did it. And it turns out most people actually like it better that way. If they've got a third bedroom with a good internet connection, they can do the same thing they're doing here, taking calls for unemployment, and we can do our meetings by Zoom. Now, as we open it back up, are we going to pull some people back into our building? Sure. But we had rented office space in downtown Albuquerque for these folks, we're not going to need it anymore. And so a lot of businesses are going to be in these types of positions. And just think about the HVAC people, the security guards, the janitors, all the people that are maintaining that office may not need it as much anymore because of the way that the economic outlook and the job situation is changing. So I think an additional aspect to this moving forward is to say to folks, and how do you do this in a way that is sensitive? Because this is hard. If you've been doing something for a long time, to change over is real hard. I mean, we know that there's going to be jobs in healthcare, IT, construction, education, those types of jobs, but getting people to go back to school and say, hey, you need to learn a new skill, that's a really tough thing to do. And it takes people a lot of time maybe to get to that point. So from a time perspective, those are two of the things that I see really contributing to this going on for a while. And once again, reinforcing the needs that these things need to get extended now, because this ain't going away in the next 3 weeks.
Thank you. We got another question related to Alison's remarks. You know, marginalized communities that are being impacted most by this pandemic, and particularly because of the unemployment situation. We like to think that Congress is going to act, and we hope that they do. But what happens if they don't? And that's for everyone, for anybody who wants to answer.
Well, from the Georgia end, we actually subsidize our state unemployment insurance. So right now, our plan, because our budget is somewhat healthy, we would continue to do that through this year. We also would begin to make interest payments back on the monies that we have borrowed from the feds. We're going to get through December, we'll be okay. But as we roll into January in the first quarter, we're not in a position that we're going to be able to fund that ourselves yet again. So we would have to continue our borrowing with the associated interest. Those are the immediate things that I see right there on the horizon. Obviously, there's more far-ranging things that would come from that as we begin to allocate what are always vital resources in our world and yours. And also, depending on whether or not I'm right on what happens in the first and second quarter with our refunds.
So Stephen, I'll go next. We got 33,000 whatever people on PUA right now. These are your barbers, massage therapists, food truck owners, all those guys. They're out at the end of the year. You're going to have all those folks go from getting something to not get something in the next 2 weeks. Some of those people are actually cycling off now because 39 weeks from the middle of March is now, but everyone will be off by the end of the year because the program will go away. You'll have another 30-something thousand people in the state that are getting on the extended benefits program. We'll have to shift them over to the federal extension benefit, but those guys will all run out by the end of March. And then you're going to have more and more people run through their 26 weeks of benefits that they get here in New Mexico onto these extra programs that run out. So, you know, New Mexico's got 2 million people. We're not that big. You get 100,000 folks that are out, that's rough. And what are you going to see? I mean, I showed you the emails. That's with our current situation where we're doing everything we can to help everyone as good as we can. You're going to have more crime. You're going to have more mental health issues. You're going to have more issues of people feeding their kids, some more hunger. You're going to have a lot more suicide issues. All those things are going to come into play if people don't have the basic needs. The stress level right now is unbearable for many people in our state. They need this help to help. No one thought it would go this long. I hear it, but they need it. And there are real life, specific, painful consequences if this is not extended.
And I think for the employer community, the issue is honestly, it's not just the extension of the UI, of the UI benefits. It's to not have another COVID bill means to continue to not have the payroll protection program, which the small employers need to be able to continue to operate. They've been hanging on as long as they can and trying to do what they can do during the warmer months and trying to stay open. But as the numbers of cases increases, as the weather gets colder in areas that get colder, businesses are going to have fewer and fewer opportunities to do that. I mean, restaurants aren't going to be able to, if you're in Minnesota, you're not going to be able to be outside, eating outside. Your restaurants might have been able to last up until now, but they're going to have to shut down. And so as they shut down, if they're able to do other things, maybe it's transferred to delivery or something like that, that's great. And the PPP program can help do that. But without the extension and without the extension and improvements to PPP, you won't see that. So when that happens, then employees get laid off. So there's more stress on the UI system. You have more stress on the UI system. It creates more stress on the trust fund system. Then we get the triggering of the, of the taxes on employers who are already having to lay off staff, and it just becomes this cycle. And that's not even looking at the childcare issues and the difficulty that people can't go back to work, even if their places of employment are open, if they don't have a safe place for childcare. The stress that the childcare system is under in terms of, you have to have more staff because you need to have social distancing. And so there can be fewer kids who are able to play with each other. The PPP that is involved in the expense of that. Many of them are home child care providers. So that it's not like they go to Costco just like everybody else to go get their PPP, their toilet paper and all of that. So there's not even an easy way for them to continue to operate their businesses, which means employees can't go back to work. And it creates a whole different stress on employers. And so honestly, it's not an option, Stephen, for the business community. It's not having the COVID relief. It becomes such a cycle. It's not an option.
Thank you. And I will just say, just to piggyback on what was said about state trust funds, states, if action is not taken by Congress on state trust funds to bridge the gap and to help them pay back those loans, or to make sure that they don't have to take out loans, eventually, no matter what happens, no matter how many interest rate moratoriums are extended, businesses are going to have to pay for that. And in many cases, states are going to have to pay for it. And so delay on that is ultimately putting at risk the very businesses that are going to be needed in order for the national economy to recover, but also state economies to recover. And while the trust fund issue is aided, at least temporarily, by the loans that they're taking out, those loans are exacerbating a problem for businesses and magnifying it down the road, and also magnifying it for states. So action on that is needed sooner rather than later. Bill.
Well, Steve, yeah, I just want to address that real quick for the national folks in Congress and at whatever national agencies are on here. Look, some states might also choose to say, hey, we're not going to raise our taxes. And what happens then? Automatically in law, the federal government will raise taxes, right? So there was a state or two after the Great Recession that said, we're not going to do this because of political reasons. And they said, businesses would come back and say, well, our taxes are going up. Well, the feds are doing it. Talk to your congressman, right? And that is what will happen in some cases if this isn't going to happen, even if the states decide we're not going to do this. So I just want to make sure that's out there for folks.
Thank you. We are close to reaching the end of our time. Before we end this, I want to give our speakers one last minute to briefly share some final words if they'd like. All right. I really appreciate, all of those who've joined us. I appreciate our speakers for taking the time to join us and to sharing their perspective and making sure that you all know how unemployment is impacting individuals that they're working with every day. I'd also like to thank those who are not on camera right now: John Jukery from the National Conference of State Legislatures, Courtney Scarvin from the National Governors Association, and also Alison and her staff from the U.S. Chamber for making this possible. If you have any questions or want to know how to help, whether that be at the state level or the federal level, please feel free to reach out to us. If you got an invitation to this, you have one of our emails. We need your help. If you're in Congress, we really need your help over the coming days. And from all of the organizations that are represented on this call, we would say, please help us. Please help those individuals who are depending on this to survive and feed their families. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.